So he was a real Christian who really did love Jesus. I mean, Saint Nicholas loved Jesus.
When he was born, Christianity was an illegal minority faith, persecuted faith. When he died, Christianity was not only legalized, but was the preferred faith of the empire.
How did Saint Nicholas become known in history as the greatest gift giver?
I think he points us back to Christ, and it points us back to the biblical example of generosity and justice.
My first guest serves as chair of the Department of Christian Studies at Campbell University. Adam English teaches Christian theology and philosophy, and he's the author of The Saint Who Would Be Santa Claus, The True Life and Trials of Nicholas of Myra. I love the fact that we're talking about a real person named Saint Nicholas. It's not just the Kris Kringle we see in cartoons. It's not just Santa Claus, who is a fairy tale, but a real guy who was such a beloved Christian that they sainted him, and he's now part of our traditions thousands of years later.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. You're talking about somebody who lived in the late 3rd century and early 4th century in a town in Myra, which is on the southern coast of Turkey, and became a pastor, a bishop of the area, and lived a life of great works and did amazing things and followed the example of Jesus.
So he was a real Christian who really did love Jesus. I mean, Saint Nicholas loved Jesus.
Yeah, absolutely. That's one of the delightful facts about him. He saw himself as a pastor, to be sure, of the town, but he also saw himself as a patron of the people. And so a number of the stories are not only about him doing pastoral works of good deeds, but also serving his community. One great story I love about him is there was a famine in the area. So you think everything that comes with a drought and a famine and disease, and a grain ship was passing through, and St. Nicholas himself, and think about this as a pastor, went down to the port at Andriaki and stopped the ship and bartered for grain to be released to the city and to pay for it. So you saved the city from starvation. And you think about that as a patron of the city, as an example of Christ, and as the work of a pastor.
I love this. This is redeeming Saint Nicholas, Santa Claus, for us as families. And I can't wait to hear more of these stories that you have in your book. How did Saint Nicholas become known in history as the greatest gift giver of all time?
One of the earliest stories about Saint Nicholas, he had not yet become a pastor, a bishop. He was a young man. He just recently lost his parents and had an inheritance to spend and was burdened by it, what to do with this. He learned of a family in town who'd recently lost everything. And the father was in desperation, considering selling off his daughters into some kind of enslavement or servitude. And he decides to intervene. But remembering the words of Christ that you should not let your right hand know what your left hand is doing in gift-giving, he decided to give his gifts anonymously and slip by the house late one night, just dropping a bag of gold through the window. It was discovered in the morning, and that money was used as a dowry for one of the daughters. Nicholas returned and did it a second and then a third time to save those daughters. And that's really the reason he's become so associated with gift-giving. The story, as it got told and retold, some versions had him dropping the gold down the chimney and it landing in some stockings or some shoes that were drying by the fire. And very quickly, parents wanted to start to give those similar kind of gifts to their children around the holiday season.
One of the things that is so interesting about iconic men like this throughout history is that there is a mix of both the true story and then the embellished fairy tales. These are things that often happen with these heroes of history. And then we mythologize them, and pretty soon he's a jolly old elf with a big red suit, and he's got a team of reindeer. And so it's fascinating to me to go through your book like this and find out what's true, what's historical, and then what is embellishment.
You got to think a lot of these stories are passed through families as families retell the stories at Christmas time. And of course, they're adding embellishments, they're adding details to them. So there's as much legend as there is history in the stories of Nicholas, which make them exciting stories to tell.
Tell us, Adam, what would we be most surprised to learn about Nicholas of Myra?
Yeah, I think what people would really be surprised to learn about him, he was a jolly gift giver, but he also stood for justice, and he stood for fairness. And so a number of the stories have him defending the rights of people falsely accused. And that's one of the reasons he's also a patron saint of prisoners and the falsely accused, is because of that association. There's a fabulous story where he intervenes in an execution in the middle of town and stops the execution, realizing this is a false accusation, and he makes things right. And I think that round sense of fairness that Nicholas brings to the stories of generosity and gift giving, I think that would surprise a lot of people.
Yeah. I think this is absolutely fascinating. At what point in history did Santa Claus become associated with the elves and a jolly elf with a big red suit and a team of reindeer?
Yeah, the story of Saint Nicholas really is an American story. You have America in the early 1800s is a mix of German and Dutch and French and all of this. And they're all bringing their separate traditions. And you have people who are also wanting to create truly American traditions. John Pintard in New York and Washington Irving began looking at St. Nicholas as this perfect model, somebody that could bring together a lot of cultures and create new traditions. And so you've got all of that in the early 1800s happening. You've also got commercialization. You've got vendors who are looking for someone to sell products at the holidays, and who more trustworthy than St. Nicholas? And if you could plump him up and put him in a red suit, he would look so much better. So it's a process of domestication, commercialization, and all of that. And storytelling, too. There's a lot of storytelling that goes on. The night before Christmas, the great poem, and all the traditions that go along.
Yeah. Embellishment and then illustrating those embellishments, and then all of a sudden that becomes the iconic figure that we know today. I even heard the story that it was a soft drink company that had Saint Nicholas dressed up in a green suit, but that the green suit didn't sell as many soft drinks. They changed the color to red, and it worked, and it stuck.
Yeah, Haddon Sundblom in 1931 illustrated the first Coca-Cola commercial using Santa Claus in that iconic red suit. But others had already been portraying him in a similar way, but he really gets the credit. Those Coca-Cola commercials are just so classic.
If we had a more historically accurate picture of the real St. Nicholas, how might that change our Christmas traditions?
Yeah, I think that it would help us to balance out the gift giving and the family celebrations with acts of kindness, acts of generosity, and especially community acts done anonymously. That's one of the markers of St. Nicholas. He's giving gifts, but he's doing it without recognition and trying to do it in the spirit of Christ and not to get glory for himself. So I would love to see families recapture some of that essence of St. Nicholas.
Adam, what events was Nicholas a part of that shaped historic Christianity?
Yeah, so Nicholas lived at an amazing point in history. When he was born, Christianity was an illegal minority faith, persecuted faith. When he died, Christianity was not only legalized, but was the preferred faith of the empire. And Constantine is really responsible for that, who came to power in about 312.
Now, which empire was this?
The Roman Empire. Yeah, I should have said that. In the year 325, the Emperor Constantine calls a council to Nicaea, which is a watershed event in the history of Christianity.
Yes.
Because it's really here that Christians come together, Christian leaders come together and articulate what is it that we as Christians believe about Jesus Christ, the center of our faith. And so it's at this council that they produce the very famous Nicene Creed and have a number of tremendous debates. And Nicholas is present at this council.
Wow.
And so that's pretty remarkable.
That is really remarkable. And what happened at this council?
So we don't have the records of the debates that happened at the council, but one of the great antagonists, the arch heretics was this guy Arius, who had given Christ a little bit lower place than divinity. Ultimately, that did not win out. And so there are some fabulous legends that come out regarding Nicholas's participation in the council.
Yes. Tell us about the fabulous Nicholas and the memes that I get on my phone every Christmas.
So this is purely legendary, but the story is told that Arius is standing and presenting these blasphemous ideas about Christ. Nicholas can no longer contain it, stands up and slaps him in the face. For such an offense, though, in front of the emperor, Nicholas is stripped of his bishop's robes, and he's imprisoned for the remainder of the council. And so a lot of times in imagery, you'll see Nicholas without the mitre hat and some of his garments of the bishop's attire, referencing that story. So, it's purely legendary, but you'll see at Christmas time memes scattered around the internet referring to, I came here to hand out presents and punch heretics, and I just ran out of presents.
That's right.
Things like that. So if you see something like that about Santa Claus punching a heretic, that's where that story comes from.
Do we know that it's not true?
Absolutely. For one thing, Arius himself was not present at the council. A letter from Arius was read at the council. For another thing, the story first appears in the 1400s, so long after all of the events that take place there, which is a shame, isn't it?
That is a shame.
There's another story, real quick, a legendary story about Nicholas at the council, that he, in order to demonstrate the Trinity, God is Father, Son, and Spirit, he held a brick in his hand and said, in the same way this brick is one object, it is also composed of fire, sand, and water. And as he said this, the brick, caught flames, degraded into sand and water in his hand. So purely legendary, but some fabulous stories that you can dig up on the life of Saint Nicholas at the council.
Tell us the story of how Nicholas became the patron of prisoners.
Yeah. A convoy of Roman soldiers came to town, and a riot broke out in town. Nicholas, again, not only as pastor, but as a patron of the city, went down to the harbor and negotiated with the soldiers and the convoy to break up this riot and stop the chaos. He so impressed the 3 Roman officers that they remembered who he was. Later, back in Constantinople, these 3 officers were arrested on charges of treason against the Emperor Constantine, slated for execution. And the story goes that Nicholas appears to Constantine in a dream, telling him that these men are innocent. And so from that point on, prisoners began to look not only to Christ, but also to St. Nicholas, thinking, here's somebody who can relate to us in prison. But even further than that, another connection is that there's evidence to suggest that Nicholas, during the final persecution against the Christians, was himself imprisoned and perhaps even tortured for a time and then released. So he has a number of connections to those who have been falsely accused, those who have spent time in jail. And I think that's one of the beautiful aspects of relatability.
Yeah, I think it's just fascinating that a real man, Nicholas of Myra, is so beloved by so many that he's standing for righteousness. He's there at the council. He's got his robes stripped from him. He's no longer got his position within the church. But then I believe they gave it back to him because he was so loved. And then when he died, there were those who hated him so much for what he stood for that they dug up his bones, right? They wanted to get rid of them. And then they were divided and they were honored in different places. And then everybody wants to claim him as part of their sect and their group. And that's just fabulous. I wonder how he's thinking in heaven right now as he's looking at how his life has been turned into not just this book, but Santa Claus by Coca-Cola and all of these things.
That's a good question. What would he be thinking about this? Nicholas is beloved, by far the most popular non-biblical saint in all of history. Hundreds of churches named after Nicholas, townships named after him, and of course, parents naming their children after Nicholas in a lot of varieties. So, he's beloved, but I think he points us back to Christ, and it points us back to the biblical example of generosity and justice.
So, Adam, how do you blend all of the myth and embellishment of the real Saint Nicholas of Myra together with the birth of Christ and the real reason for the season at Christmas with your own family?
Yeah, with our own family, we try to do both. In some ways, I think there's nothing wrong with gift giving at the Christmas season, celebrating the holiday, singing carols, putting up a tree, all of that. But December 6th is St. Nicholas Day. And so families have an opportunity to celebrate on December 25th all the Christmas traditions, but then on December 6th, maybe think about adding a tradition, a St. Nicholas tradition of generosity, gift giving, doing something, a work of service for the community, giving a gift anonymously, baking cookies for your neighbors, whatever that might be, that you could say, we want to have a little bit of both. And I think that's a good tradition people could add to their holiday activities.
I made a little movie called Saving Christmas some years ago, which was rated by some as the worst movie ever made on the planet. Later found out that some atheists on Reddit had organized through their networks those to rate it horribly in order to tank the Christian message in there. And admittedly, some of it was cheesy, but what I loved about it was the idea of debunking those Christian legalists who want to do away with all of this and only focus on the birth of Christ. Some of them say, if you look in the Old Testament, it says you shouldn't be having these Christmas trees with silver and gold around a tree, specifically mentioned in some of the Old Testament books. And they're so concerned about the voodoo hocus pocus of pagan celebrations that they don't understand the wonderful opportunity of a Christian takeover of what may have been pagan festivals and then using them for the honor of Jesus Christ at this time of year when the sky is dark and it's cold and He is the light of the world. And I just loved the fact that we can take heart that we have a God who is a spirit but became flesh and entered into this world in the form of a man that we can see and touch. Therefore, I think that while we shouldn't max out our credit cards, we shouldn't go into debt through consumerism, but we can embrace the Spirit of Christ and the message of an incarnate God by having friends and family over and making a big meal and giving gifts to one another and downloading the truth about Christmas into things that actually encourage us and bring glory to God.
Yeah. The incarnation, the Word made flesh, is at the heart of Christianity. And I don't think we should shy away from that. Of course, you can overdo it, but I'm not sure that cutting ourselves off from all material joys and blessings at the holiday season to focus on Christ will make this holiday any more holier.
Yeah.
A lot of times, distance, putting God at a further remove, doesn't make the heart grow fonder. It makes the heart forget. And I think as we try to carve out this season and say we're only going to make this a spiritual celebration and not participate in any of the rest, it won't make us better people. It'll make us sadder, poorer people in a lot of ways and experience.
If I think of those two great commandments, love God with all of your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. Can't we do that at Christmas time? Can't we do that at every season of the year? And what better time to do it than at Christmas when people are just a little kinder, people are just a little more open to generosity, and it's an emotional time of year for many of us who have lost loved ones, going through difficult times. And it's a beautiful context in which we can share the gospel with people. Christ, the light of the world, who made you and loves you and sent a Savior for you. I love the music. I love the food. I love everything about Christmas. I can't say enough about it. And
I love that message as well. And you're right, that these, putting up the tree, putting up the lights, that these are acts of love. And these are acts of family and warmth and generosity and trying to make the season brighter. I think those are things that we should cherish and celebrate.
So you're saying that serious Christians can celebrate Christmas without qualms of conscience.
And they can do it in the cheesiest way possible.
I love it. Christmas sweaters and all?
Absolutely.
Adam, thanks so much. This book is on my reading list this Christmas. Thank you.